They say the desert remembers. And somewhere, buried beneath the unblinking sun and the drifting dunes of the Nile's edge, lies the skeleton of a little girl, no older than 10, her hands clasped together as if in prayer, her skull adorned with a headdress far too regal for her age. Her grave was not meant to be found, yet it was, and with it, a secret whispered from the ancient sands. Children in Egypt were not merely born into life, they were born into destiny. But who were these children really? Were they innocents chasing butterflies along the banks of the Nile, or were they something more, a generation shaped by gods, rituals, and fears we can barely comprehend today? Let us step back 4,000 years and watch, not from the distance of textbooks, but with breath held and eyes wide, as if we were there. The morning in Wazit begins before the sun even rises. A boy named Haru, barely 6 years old, awakens not to a mother's embrace, but to the shrill voice of an overseer. He belongs to a family of scribes, so his fate is already sealed. By noon, he'll be hunched over a reed mat, grinding ink from soot and ochre, whispering spells of Thoth for protection as he scratches symbols onto broken shards of pottery, ostraca. But Haru is not alone. Hundreds of children rise like him, in the quiet tyranny of ritual. Education was a privilege, yes, but in Egypt, privilege came with chains. To be taught was to be bound. Boys from noble families, sons of priests, merchants, soldiers, were sent to the house of instruction, where discipline was not metaphorical. It was literal, carved into their backs with canes when they forgot the difference between the eye of Horus and the determinative for to sail. They chanted lessons like spells, their voices in unison summoning the weight of dynasties past. But not all were so fortunate. In the stifling alleyways of Memphis, other children, those of butchers, dancers, and farmers, learned differently. A girl named Netjeret stands barefoot, helping her grandmother mix herbs into a thick paste to treat the boils on a fisherman's arm. She doesn't read hieroglyphs, but she knows what scorpion venom smells like. She can grind carob seeds into powder blindfolded. She can look at the sky and tell you if the gods will flood the river this year. She has no scrolls, but she holds ancient wisdom in her hands, passed from mouth to mouth, touch to touch. What did children eat in these bifurcated worlds? In Haru's stone courtyard, he is fed honey cakes, figs, and lentils soaked in oil. Bread is everything. It is the currency of sustenance. But Nedjeret steals bites of roasted catfish when no one looks, scrapes pomegranate seeds from the inside of a cracked bowl, and dreams of tasting date, wine she knows she's forbidden. The elite drank cow's milk cooled in clay jars. The poor drank goat's milk soured by sun. Everyone, regardless of caste, drank beer. Yes, even children. It was diluted, but the bitterness remained, a taste of life's burdens served early. Clothes were whispers in the wind. The heat demanded modesty be suspended. Young boys ran naked until adolescence. Girls wore simple linen sheaths, tied at the shoulder, often with beads or shells sewn in if the family could afford them. Wealthier children had wigs. Hair was shaved for cleanliness, and these wigs were curled, perfumed, and sometimes adorned with gold wires. Imagine Haru, sitting stiffly as a servant oils his scalp and carefully pins on the wig that signals his place in society. It itches. He hates it, but he says nothing. Silence is learned quickly in a world ruled by order. But even within that order lurked strange customs. Have you heard of the sidelock of youth? A distinctive hairstyle, shaved everywhere but one dangling lock on the side of the head, marking a child as not yet initiated into adulthood. That lock was sacred. To cut it was to declare the child ready for transformation, a ritual both feared and celebrated. One boy, it said, cut his own sidelock in secret, hoping to trick his parents into declaring him a man. That night, the gods sent him dreams of being swallowed by Sobuk, the crocodile god. The next morning, he was found sleepwalking into the Nile, whispering names no one had taught him. Children played, yes. They had toys, pull-along animals made of wood, balls of tightly wrapped papyrus, even dolls with real hair. But the line between play and preparation was thin. A noble girl might dance in rhythm to a tambourine today, and tomorrow be selected to perform in a temple ceremony. A boy might wrestle in the courtyard today, and tomorrow be taken to watch his uncle embalm the dead. It was said that to be truly Egyptian, One must face death before 13, not in the literal sense, but in knowing it, naming it, and understanding that Ma'at, cosmic balance, demanded a life lived in preparation for the next. Some children, however, never reached that understanding. In a newly discovered tomb near Saqqara, archaeologists found the remains of 12 children, buried together, each with a golden scarab pressed to their lips. No inscriptions, no names, only a tablet nearby with a cryptic message. The mouth must remain sealed. The gods are listening. No one knows what it means. No one knows why they died. But one theory, dismissed by scholars, yet persistent among the local diggers, suggests these were children trained as listeners, intermediaries between priests and the divine. When one of them spoke a forbidden truth, they were all silenced. The desert remembers, but it doesn't always explain. So we are left piecing together their lives with fragments, shards of pottery, remnants of linen, echoes carved into limestone. Heru grows. Nedjeret vanishes from the records. But in the bones of those small, silent bodies, we find questions that still haunt us. Were these children free? Were they happy? Or were they merely extensions of dynasties and destinies, born into roles from which they could not escape? They told stories under the stars, children huddled in corners of stone courtyards, listening to grandmothers with fading tattoos on their arms and voices that trembled like papyrus in the wind. In these stories, children spoke with gods, challenged pharaohs, and sometimes, in the strangest tales, disappeared into the underworld and returned carrying secrets no adult could bear to hear. One such tale was that of Senub, a boy born with crooked legs and a face said to be kissed by the moon itself. He was mocked at first, shunned by others his age, until one evening he wandered into the temple garden and returned with a cobra curled around his neck, unbitten. The gods have chosen him, the priest said. From that night onward, he sat in the inner chambers with men 3 times his age, interpreting omens from the shapes of oil stains and the patterns of bird droppings on temple walls. He died before reaching 10, but his name was etched into temple stone, a child not as a victim of fate, but as an embodiment of it. Such were the contradictions of youth in ancient Egypt. Children were expected to be obedient, yet some were venerated as vessels of the divine. Most were raised to serve, but a few, by blood, by talent, or by mystery, rose to command reverence. What bound them all was the weight of preparation. Childhood was not merely a time of play, but a training ground for eternity. Each morning began with rituals, washing with sacred water, offering a whisper to the protective gods Bes or Taret, depending on one's lineage and fears. Girls were taught early how to knead dough for both bread and offerings, how to recite blessings over food, and how to trace the symbols of Isis into the flour before baking. Boys learned the names of bones and tendons as they watched their fathers slaughter animals, or when they served as apprentices to potters, scribes, or in rare cases, embalmers. The latter was considered both an honor and a horror. Imagine a 9-year-old boy standing in the house of purification, holding an oil jar as the elder carefully removed the organs of a nobleman. The child cannot speak. He cannot look away. He dreams that night of jackals with human eyes. In Thebes, inscriptions speak of the child initiates, boys and girls selected to witness temple rituals for the dead, allowed to stand behind the veil and glimpse the sacred choreography of resurrection. These children were forbidden from speaking of what they saw. Some never spoke again. Others became priests before they reached adulthood, their innocence traded for secrets. Clothing evolved with age. Young boys remained unclothed until puberty, not due to negligence, but due to sacred beliefs about purity and vulnerability. Only once a boy reached a certain age, typically marked by the growth of his voice and the slight bend in his shadow at sunset, was he permitted to wear a full linen kilt. This rite of clothing often coincided with another, the first viewing of the family tomb. A child would be led by hand into the crypt of his ancestors, where he would place a single lotus flower on the sarcophagus of a long-dead relative. This act, simple on the surface, was deeply symbolic. It was the moment the child stepped into the continuum of memory, a thread in the great weaving of time. Food remained both nourishment and symbol. On special days, children participated in feasts of the dead, where they ate foods favored by their ancestors, dried duck, lentil stew, and triangular cakes soaked in honey and pomegranate juice. They were taught to chew slowly, respectfully, and always to leave a portion on the plate for the ka, the spiritual double of the ancestor. To finish a meal entirely was seen as greed or forgetfulness. But what of their games? Were they never truly children? They were, and their games were surprisingly complex. They played a game not unlike modern-day Senate, believed to be a symbolic journey through the underworld. Children learned the rules early, not merely for entertainment, but to prepare the soul. To win a Senate game was not just skill, it was seen as a sign of favor from Osiris. Girls had dolls with jointed limbs, carved from ivory and wood. Some of these dolls had elaborate hairstyles, tiny necklaces, and painted eyes that still shine eerily when unearthed. Boys played with throwing sticks, practiced wrestling, and chased each other across sand dunes in mock battles that echoed the wars of gods and pharaohs. But sometimes games blurred into darker territories. One account, half eroded from time, tells of a group of children who reenacted the myth of Set and Osiris. One boy volunteered to play Osiris. They tied him to a wooden board and covered him with mud and leaves. When the adults found them, the boy had stopped breathing. The story ends abruptly, but the final line reads, "The gods do not always enjoy being copied." Some children were born into temples, called children of the cap. They were often orphans or those given to the priesthood by families seeking divine favor. These children were raised not by parents, but by ritual, educated in the lore of the gods, bathed in silence, and forbidden from contact with the outside world until adulthood. Some never left the temple. A few, records say, forgot their birth names and were known only by the gods they served. But not all was solemnity. Children laughed. They ran through markets, stole dried fruit from distracted vendors, danced to the rhythm of flutes, and climbed fig trees when no one watched. They teased crocodiles from safe distances, painted crude gods onto walls, and made up stories of invisible cats that whispered fortunes in the dark. A favorite tale told by children in the Delta region spoke of a girl who could command animals. She was said to have been born with golden eyes and a voice that made birds land on her shoulders. When soldiers came to burn her village, she sang a single note, and every cobra within 3 miles rose from the sand and struck the invaders. Of course, it's just a tale, or so we think. What makes the children of ancient Egypt unforgettable is not simply that they lived, learned, and died, but that in the fragments they left behind, they still whisper. A small sandal made of reeds, no bigger than a palm, found in a child's grave near Abydos. A clay tablet with a single word misspelled, scratched out clumsily, and corrected beneath. A piece of jewelry too heavy for a child's wrist, yet worn until death. These things speak, if we know how to listen. They say, "I was here. I mattered. I dreamed. And though the sand has swallowed my name, it has not buried my soul." We will never know all their stories. But perhaps, if we press our ears close enough to the stone, we might hear the echo of their laughter beneath the silence. In the northern province of Akhmim, a team of workers once unearthed a child's tomb sealed not with a stone slab, but with an intricately woven mat of papyrus and reeds. Inside was a boy no older than 5, lying on his side, a wooden bird resting beneath his arm, and a painted starburst on the ceiling above him. No name, no offerings, no indication of lineage. Just the bird and the stars. For years, no one could explain the purpose of the burial. But among the locals, whispers began to spread of an ancient sect, lost to official records, that believed certain children were born as sky seeds, souls of comets trapped in mortal flesh, who, when buried correctly, could return to the heavens to become divine watchers. Whether the story is true or just desert legend is beside the point. What matters is this: children in ancient Egypt were never seen as empty vessels. They were not incomplete adults. They were bridges between earth and heaven, between past and future, between memory and myth. The ways in which they were raised reflect this belief with haunting clarity. Education, for instance, was layered. Beyond scribal training or household apprenticeship, there existed a deeper kind of schooling, an initiation into symbols, silence, and the responsibilities of remembering. Families passed down not just knowledge, but burdens. In many homes, a child would be taken to the family shrine each new moon and asked to light the sacred oil lamp. They'd be told to speak the names of ancestors aloud. Forgetting a name was not just shameful, it was dangerous. The dead depended on remembrance. The moment a name faded, so did the soul's strength in the afterlife. One tale recounts a boy who, in a moment of rebellion, refused to say his grandfather's name. That night, the household was invaded by locusts. When the boy finally whispered the name again at dawn, the insects disappeared. Superstition? Perhaps. But such tales guided behavior with the weight of fact. Gender roles, too, were carefully enforced. Girls were often taught to weave by age 5, not just for clothing, but for symbolic purposes. Weaving was a sacred act, likened to the creation of the universe. It mirrored how Neith, the creator goddess, wove the world into being from the threads of chaos. So when a little girl sat on the floor, looping fibers between her fingers, she was unknowingly reenacting cosmic birth. Some girls were even chosen to assist in temple weavings, sacred cloths used to wrap mummies or veil statues of the gods. One papyrus fragment suggests that a girl named Satmit wove a cloth so delicate, priests believed it allowed the god Ammonius to see the mortal world through it. She died at age 11. The cloth was buried with her. Clothing, as children aged, shifted from function to status. At age 7, a child of nobility might receive a necklace with a carved faience amulet shaped like a lotus or the eye of Horus. Not merely decorative, these objects were protection incarnate. They were charged through rituals, soaked in oils, and sometimes inscribed with personal spells. Children who wore them were believed to be shielded from both disease and spiritual harm. There's a recorded case in the temple of Hatshepsut where a boy fell sick and was brought to the priests. When they found he had lost his amulet, they declared it not an illness, but a spiritual imbalance. He was bathed in sacred waters and re-amulet. He recovered within the week. Coincidence, perhaps, but belief often matters more than truth in the ancient world. Meals were more than sustenance. They were ceremonies in miniature. A child's first taste of duck or date wine was often accompanied by a whispered blessing. Families tracked what foods their children liked and disliked, not just for care, but for astrology. A child who disliked onions might be said to have a soul under the influence of Seth, a rebellious deity. A preference for fish suggested favor from Hathor. These judgments shaped how a child was spoken to, taught, even married off. Arranged unions sometimes began as early as age 8, with symbolic exchanges of goods. Real cohabitation would come later, but the promise was sealed. And children, knowing this, played marriage games, where they traded beads and flowers in mock ceremonies that sometimes mimicked rituals with eerie precision. In tomb paintings, we see children with dogs and monkeys. Yes, pets were common, but often symbolic. A monkey might represent Thoth's mischief, while a dog could be linked to Anubis and the afterlife. To lose a pet was treated with mourning. A boy named Camos is recorded as having built a miniature tomb for his gazelle. The tomb had carvings, incense burners, and even a scaled-down sarcophagus. Visitors to the site today often report a strange silence when standing near it, as though something still lingers. Illness was feared above all. The Nile gifted life, but also disease. Children were the most vulnerable. Protective charms were common, worn like second skin. The dwarf god Bes, with his grotesque face and protruding tongue, was a favorite, meant to scare off invisible forces that preyed on children's dreams. A small amulet with his image was often tied around the ankle or sewn into a child's bedding. Some homes even had dream jars, ceramic vessels into which a child could whisper a nightmare. The jar would then be sealed and buried under the house, trapping the fear within. But sometimes, the fears were not so easily buried. Children who reported seeing spirits, particularly of dead relatives, were sometimes isolated, not out of punishment, but respect. Such children were thought to have open gates, souls too thin to block the worlds apart. A girl named Minna, age 10, claimed to see her dead sister every night by the fire pit. Her mother took her to the temple of Isis, where she was anointed with juniper oil and given an ivory wand. That wand now rests in the Egyptian museum, its carvings nearly faded, but its aura oddly persistent. And so the paradox grows deeper. Children were precious, fragile, joyful, and feared. They were blessed and burdened. They were taught not only how to live, but how to die, and to do so with balance, honor, and memory intact. Because the greatest crime in Egyptian belief was not murder. It was being forgotten. And so children became memory keepers. A boy was taught to recount the names of gods in the right order. A girl learned to prepare the mortuary bread without flaw. Even a simple lullaby sung at bedtime was laced with sacred imagery. Osiris rising, Ra's journey across the sky, the weighing of the heart. What lullabies do we sing today? How many of our children sleep to the rhythm of stars and judgment? In Egypt, they did. And in doing so, they were woven into the tapestry of eternity, thread by thread, whisper by whisper. They say that if you listen closely at twilight along the banks of the Nile, you can still hear them. The whispers of children long gone, humming fragments of songs in a language the river never forgot. These weren't just melodies to pass the time. Each note carried meaning. A lullaby could be a protection spell. A nursery rhyme might recount an ancient battle. Even counting games, tapping pebbles against stone, were encoded with the rhythms of the gods. One popular game, played with bones of birds shaped into cubes, was not simply a game of chance, but believed to be a way to read Ra's favor. The child who won 3 rounds in a row was thought to have been smiled upon by the sun god himself. It was then customary for that child to whisper a wish into a sealed reed basket and float it on the river. Sometimes the basket would return, sometimes it would not, and sometimes, days later, the child would wake up crying, claiming that something in the river had whispered back. Children did not fear the supernatural. They lived beside it. Every shadow, every strange animal cry at night, was a sign. Children interpreted omens more freely than adults who were too bound by ritual and fear. This made children valuable, even dangerous. In some temples, there were records of children chosen to observe eclipses or sandstorms because their reactions were said to be pure, unfiltered by politics or pride. A child gasping at a red sun was taken more seriously than a priest reading omens in entrails. And so, hidden beneath the simplicity of youth was a deep spiritual authority. Not all accepted this. There were those who feared it. In one region near Elephantine, a boy named Ames reportedly predicted a flood with such precision that his village believed him cursed. When the waters came exactly as he said, the priests demanded his exile. His mother hid him in the crypts beneath a granary, feeding him secretly through a carved hole in the wall. He died before his 12th birthday. His tomb, unmarked, bears a single symbol, the wave. Stories like Ames remind us that even in a society as structured as ancient Egypt, the unpredictable power of a child's voice could disrupt the flow of Ma'at, the cosmic order. But what was this order really? And how did it shape every moment of a child's life? From birth, a child was evaluated. A favorable birth date determined by the position of Sirius, the goddess Sopdit's star, was celebrated as an omen of greatness. Midwives often whispered the child's name 3 times upon cutting the umbilical cord, not to announce the child to the world, but to announce the world to the child. This is sand. This is sky. This is you. It was believed that if a child didn't hear those 3 phrases, their soul might not fully attach to their body. Bathing was another rite. Infants were washed not just in water, but in mixtures of lotus and myrrh, sometimes with a single drop of crocodile oil, believed to give resilience. The first breath, the first cry, the first step, everything was recorded on small clay tablets by scribes in wealthier families. Poorer families marked the milestones with carvings in doorframes or small dots on pots they used daily. The record-keeping wasn't bureaucratic. It was spiritual. To remember was to anchor the soul, and to forget was to condemn it to wander. Discipline was strict but nuanced. Contrary to popular depictions, children were not beaten senselessly. The ideal was guidance through example. Fathers taught by action, mothers by story. Still, punishment existed, often in symbolic form. A child who lied might be made to sit in a room filled with broken jars, each representing a shattered truth. One might be told to recite a story backward, to confuse the spirits that had influenced their misbehavior. The idea wasn't just to correct behavior, but to cleanse the energy of the act. And still, there was joy. Much of it. The festival of Opet, for example, was a time when even the poorest families dressed their children in flowers and paraded them to the river, where they would be blessed by temple servants. Children laughed, tossed petals into the wind, ate honeyed bread until their bellies ached. They wore face paint and chased geese across the courtyards. These were days where the veil between divine and human was thinnest, and children were said to be closest to the gods. At night, families lit oil lamps and gathered to watch shadow plays. Priests behind stretched linen sheets, retelling myths of Horus and Isis with puppets. Children knew the stories by heart, but they gasped every time as if hearing them anew. And perhaps, in a way, they were. For in their reactions, the myths stayed alive. And when the plays ended, mothers sang ancient songs into their children's ears, songs older than pyramids, songs that even time feared to erase. One such song, recovered partially from a wall in Amarna, begins, "Child of my blood, breath of the river, walk gentle, dream far, and never forget the stars." In some homes, these songs were believed to shape the child's dreams, that dreams themselves were portals to future lives. And so, dreams were recorded, yes, even by children. Papyrus scrolls contain scribbled entries by children no older than 8. "I flew to the sun and saw my grandfather. A lion spoke to me and gave me salt. I held a black stone and everyone disappeared." We read them today and wonder, were they imagination or messages from something deeper? Whatever the answer, the Egyptians believed. And in that belief, children were both prophets and pilgrims. Even in death, their journeys were honored. Child coffins were crafted with care, painted with stars, boats, or fields of reed. Some had poems. One read, "She ran like the ibis flies. May she now run forever." Others had silence, only symbols, inks, lotuses, spirals. But in every burial, no matter the status, one thing was almost always included: a toy. A carved animal, a miniature harp, a spinning top. Not as tokens of nostalgia, but as tools. For the next world, they believed, was not free of struggle. A child would need their joy as armor. And thus, they were prepared, not just for life, but for everything beyond it. Egypt did not see childhood as fleeting. It was sacred, potent, and eternal. A fire not to be extinguished, but carried. A whisper not to be silenced, but remembered. Even now, when we brush dust from their toys and trace their names on crumbling walls, it is not silence we find. It is presence. It is the unmistakable echo of their truth, that a child is never just a child. A child is history waiting to be heard. There is a chamber beneath the temple of Dendera, rarely visited, half flooded with stagnant water and shadow. Carved along its inner walls, barely above the tide line, is a mural unlike any other. It depicts children, not gods, not pharaohs, but children, floating above the earth, surrounded by stars, each holding a different symbol: a scribe's brush, a lotus, a jar of oil, a small hawk. Their eyes are closed. Their feet do not touch the ground. And beneath them, a single line of hieroglyphs. They remember before we do. No one knows exactly what the mural means. Some claim it was part of a cult that believed children were reincarnated sages. Others whisper that these were the dreams of the gods before the world was formed. But what it tells us, beyond mystery, is that children were not afterthoughts in ancient Egypt. They were foundations. Without them, the cosmos would tilt. And so, the Egyptian world revolved with them at its quiet, hidden center. At night, families gathered on rooftops, lit small fires in bowls of copper, and told stories to their children, not just for entertainment, but as inheritance. Every tale carried lessons layered in metaphor. A jackal that lost its tail became a warning against arrogance. A reed that refused to bend in the wind broke and sank. Obedience to Ma'at. Children were taught that their lives were not their own, not entirely. They were echoes of ancestors and foreshadowings of gods. Each child carried a lineage of souls behind their eyes. Even laughter was sacred, a sign that the Ka, the soul's breath, was healthy and vibrant. There's evidence of professional joy bringers. Elderly women hired to make children laugh during funerals. They'd wear animal masks, mimic priests, perform cartwheels. This wasn't mockery. It was ritual. A child's laughter could guide the soul of the deceased safely through the underworld. In this world, even joy was woven into the architecture of the eternal. But time, as always, moved forward. Children grew. Girls began helping with childbirth, learning the oils and chants passed from woman to woman. Boys were tested in physical skill, courage, and knowledge. A rite called the Trial of Silence was sometimes enacted, where a boy would sit in a temple hall for an entire day, surrounded by noise, and not flinch, not speak. If he succeeded, he was allowed to observe embalming. If he failed, he was sent to work in the fields for a season. Silence was not just discipline. It was power. In silence, a child became a listener of God's. And then came death. Not all children lived long. Disease, accident, or unexplained disappearances. Death was always close, especially to the young. But the Egyptians did not consider this an end. If properly prepared, the child would continue into the field of reeds, a paradise mirroring Egypt itself, lush and eternal. To ensure this, families went to great lengths. The child's favorite food would be replicated in wax and placed beside them. Miniature boats were included for navigating the afterlife. And most curiously, some children were buried with small scrolls, not of text, but of drawings. Scenes of their life, rendered in childish line work, believed to be more powerful than words. Images spoke directly to the gods, it was said, and so, their drawings became their voice beyond the veil. A fragment recovered from a tomb in the Fayum depicts a girl standing with her family, holding hands. The sun is oversized. The river snakes across the page. And in one corner, a single word scratched in unsteady script. Again. Perhaps a wish. Perhaps a prayer. Or perhaps a promise. Even in the archaeological silence, we hear their desires. We see their dreams. And we feel the undeniable weight of their existence. These children, forgotten by name but not by story, shaped Egypt in ways no scroll could fully contain. Their play was myth. Their tears were ritual. Their footsteps carved paths into eternity. They remind us that history is not made only by the powerful, but by the small, the curious, the voiceless who watched, listened, and believed. So now, as we close the curtain on this journey, we must ask ourselves, what will we do with what we've seen? Will we remember the boy who dared to imitate Anubis, the girl who wove cloth fine enough for a god's gaze, the silent ones buried in circles of stone, the dreamers who drew suns that never set? Will we remember the ones whose lives ended before stories could be told, but whose toys still lie waiting in the dust? Because in remembering, we resurrect, and in forgetting, we bury twice. So listen once more. Beneath the hush of time, beneath the scripts and stones, there are voices. Not loud, not demanding, but patient. They are the voices of children who lived when gods walked the earth, who danced in temple shadows and whispered to crocodiles, who slept with amulets beneath their pillows and believed that the stars had names only they could pronounce. And maybe, just maybe, they were right.